This lecture looks to the developments in the Second Empire under Napoleon III, specifically Hausmannization, as Paris is going to turn into the first modern city, the city for the tourists. Now, the Second Empire, under Napoleon III, is going to be quite prosperous beginning in 1852, as he is an able administrator. He believes in science and technology, and that industry, all of which are going to be engines of progress. Now, progress, importantly, is defined in the 19th century as having a better quality of life for those living in France. The philosophers that would back this new idea of the pursuit of progress and of the increasing human integrity and happiness would be Auguste Comte, John Stuart Mill, and Jeremy Bentham, all of which would be called upon in order to support Napoleon III's ideas that we should look to support the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people, i.e. utilitarianism. So under Napoleon III, lending increases to institutions to finance public and private projects. One very important one was to expand the railroad, to further develop rural industries and jobs, to connect the country. He also helped control the price of bread to ensure there would not be food shortages, thus helping the lower classes. He, however, was unable to enforce these new rules in private enterprise, so the working conditions during the Industrial Revolution in France were still quite abysmal, as they were in England mid-century. Now, he also continued the colonial policies of the July monarchy, whereby there are colonies set up by the French in West Africa, in Senegal, Indochina, in Cambodia and Vietnam, and once again they also take over Mexico for a short period of time during the Second Empire. On a European front, there were wars against Russia in the Crimean War and Austria. They were eventually defeated in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, where Napoleon III would be ousted. But until then, we have an era of great prosperity and of building and of patronage in the arts. The most ambitious project that Napoleon undertook during this period was to complete an overhaul of Paris itself beginning in 1853, a year after taking over, with the architect and supervisor being Baron George Haussmann, who is going to redesign Paris from a medieval city to a modern one. Now, by mid-century, in the 1850s, Paris had reached 1.5 million. That's larger than ancient Rome. And they would need now to convert the medieval city with narrow, crooked streets into a modern metropolis with avenues, parks, and public buildings. As this aerial view of Paris shows, the radiating avenues and grand boulevards were Haussmann's design. This became known as Hausmannization and included a new sewer system, train stations, wider thoroughfares for carriages, and lighting at night, gas street lamps, in order to encourage people to be on the streets walking at night. He also is going to design 5- and 6-story apartment buildings for the wealthy bourgeoisie. The working class, as part of this remodel, were pushed to the periphery of the city. Therefore, Haussmann was not very popular among the working class and the working poor. The design for the new apartment buildings were inspired by the architecture of Louis XIV and the classical Baroque. It was, in fact, the Beaux-Arts style taught in the School of Fine Arts, or École des Beaux-Arts, in Paris. So we find now this refined style is going to be associated with the Louvre, which was the first palace to the kings in France, as one can see here, and extending to Versailles. This is the architectural style that was preferred in French classicizing design. So one can compare the controlled and rigid and hieratic approach that we have here in Louis XIV's preferred mode of architecture at Versailles, designed by Hardon Mansart and Laveau. Now, Karl Marx, being in Paris from 1843 to 45, referred to this as the vandalism of Haussmann. Critics are going to reject this new design on both social and aesthetic grounds. We find that Marx is going to claim that he had razed or destroyed Paris for the Paris of the sightseer. In other words, he displaced the local population in favor of designing a city for visitors, for tourists that come from out of town. And that is really how it functions today in these grand boulevards and the very wealthy shopping centers, as you see here. So what the Parisians regretted was a loss of their medieval history, and they bemoaned this uniformity that Haussmann brought in, which had all of the same visually similar structures on both sides of the boulevards, and a uniformity by way of size, distance, and scale. So in order to record these medieval structures, the government hired Charles Marville, who was a trained artist, to take pictures before the demolition of each of these different areas. So here we have a new role for photography. Previously, it had been primarily used for portraiture. Now we're using it to record what places looked like for a documentary purpose. Now here in the Avenue de l'Opera, we have the high-end street with the 6-story shops, office buildings, and an extended sidewalk for street life. All of it leads to the cultural centerpiece and crowning jewel for the government here in the period ruled over by Napoleon III, the opera. Now, Charles Garnier is responsible for designing the opera, then it epitomized the Second Empire by way of its culture and wealth. We find that prosperous bourgeoisie enjoyed the opera here, watching theater, concerts, and restaurants. This is going to showcase the prosperity that was ushered in by Napoleon III as he presents it here at a very high-end area in Paris. Now, the opera itself is actually an eclectic Baroque approach. It does have the paired columns, as seen at Versailles, but brings in other historicist elements, such as the sculptural ensembles off to the side. The facade itself has the 4 artistic elements of opera: composition, instrumental music, lyric drama, and dance can be seen down below. Now, one of 4 of these allegorical sculptures can be seen here representing dance by Jean-Baptiste Carpeaux. Here we have a nude male with a tambourine being worshipped by an entourage of nude and scantily dressed women below him. So the model in the center is looks a lot like the allegorical figures surrounded by others. But now we're reversing the genders from Liberty Leading the People. Instead of a female allegory surrounded by people, we now have a male allegory surrounded by real women. So this is going to be seen as somewhat scandalous, especially given the naturalistic forms and fleshiness of the women's body. It resembled, as people noted, a pagan bacchanalia, which is an orgiastic festival seen in Renaissance art, where you would have various figures plying themselves with wine and drink and pairing off for lovemaking sessions. Now, the women here are also not idealized, which brings them into the realm of reality, making it further scandalous. They are real plump women with drunken smiles that were seen as too close to reality. So this violated an unwritten law of public sculpture, that is, that it should edify and instruct. Therefore, this threatens public morality as they understood it. If we compare it to instrumental music, one can clearly see the difference in the restraint used here in the upright neoclassical approach by Guillaume in his stone statue that is 10 feet tall. So the neoclassical approaches were those that were officially appreciated and approved in these other areas. Entering the opera, it opens into an opulent dual staircase with arches and paired columns that continue the motif from the facade, much like the paired columns at Versailles. Here we see a color photograph of the dual stairway that leads off to each side and chandeliers throughout. A very opulent interior. Now, the interior is also decorated by sculptures and artists like Marcello with the Pythian Sibyl of 1867. Now, he is a Swiss artist, and in this case we see a Greek prophetess at Apollo's sanctuary, seated on a tripod. Her body convulses as she receives a divine message. Here we have artistic inspiration associated with religious rapture. So we find her twisting and turning appropriate for an interior of an opera, which will, of course, showcase many of the same themes in operatic performances. Now, he cast his own shoulder and left hand here, but this lacks the realism of Carpeaux. It is classically ideal in how we are going to be showing the breasts, the form of the body, and the face, but it is romantic in the use of diagonals and counter-diagonals. So a good example of the juste milieu, bringing together both sides of these approaches in classical and all ensure that such incongruities and different types of styles could be moved back under state control. We have Napoleon appointing Count Alfred de Neuwerkerk as the Director General of Museums. In that role, he would acquire modern paintings from the Salon for the Luxembourg Museum. In 1863, he becomes the Superintendent of Fine Arts, reforming the salons and the School of Fine Art, École des Beaux-Arts, essentially undoing what the revolutionaries had done, which is placing the academy back under state control. Now, we still see that innovative artists are going to be rejected at this time from the Salon. So, the state began to sponsor its own Salon de Refusés, those that are going to be refused from the Salon. Most were going to be bad or mediocre works of art, and thus were rightly refused from. But it did introduce the public to the newest trends. This is how Manet and Monet are able to get their controversial works to the public. In the 1850s, commercial galleries also become more widely available. They are accessible to anyone walking in off the street, such as the very famous Durand-Ruel Gallery, who is going to sell the works of the Barbizon School and, most famously, the Impressionists. With the expansion of these gallery spaces, the themes at the salons are very telling, for we have different categories we'll discuss now, including historical Orientalist and female nudes, especially of the Salon of 1863, otherwise known as the Salon of Venuses. Landscapes became very popular, including those with animals and hunting subcategories. Realist painting in the form of farm life and idyllic imagery, such as pastoral imagery, contemporary urban life and portraiture, which of course found growing competition from photography, and finally sculpture, which are going to be made up of small bronze statuettes, especially for the home. The new trend of historical genre painting is also interesting at this time, mid-century. Here we find an 18th century artist shown at work in his studio with three admirers. Meissonier is going to be the artist, the same artist who painted the very visceral and guttural painting of the Revolution of 1848. Here we have the tradition of the troubadour painters, which is going to be ones that focus on the aristocracy of very finely licked clean canvases, but now surpassing it in authenticity, paying very close attention to costumes, interior spaces, and historical accuracy. So historical accuracy can be seen here in the furniture and the clothing, which was carefully researched to try to give one an indication of what the interior of an artist studio 100 years earlier would have looked like. As mentioned, this style was very detailed and meticulously finished, which made it quite popular with the public. However, Baudelaire and other modern critics were quite disturbed, stating that it introduced a taste for littleness. In other words, it did not meet with or address the important or significant themes of the day, and instead looked to yesteryear and instead looked to have the public appreciate these types of works for their technical virtuosity instead of the challenge to modern living. With regards to juste milieu painters like Horace Vernet, we have the example of Vernet providing the impetus for new battles that Napoleon III had won, being celebrated here in this new regime. Here we see Meissonier, again a realist painter, in his Emperor at Solferino of 1863, whereby we see Napoleon III surveying the battlefield, whereby the French are going to assist the Piedmontese in their fight for independence from Austria. Now you'll notice that he is not shown heroically in the fray like his uncle Napoleon. Instead, what is interesting is that it shows a much more realistic and historically accurate image of this leader, that the real battlefield situation would have him removed, overlooking what's happening, instead of trying to showcase his heroism. Another artist who would aim at recreating daily life, like we just saw a moment ago, is that of Jean-Léon Gérôme. His scenes from classical antiquity were what separated him, not the contemporary scenes we noted a moment ago. So we find that 2/3 of his work were going to be Oriental by nature, but his Neo-Greek style is going to be aimed at painting and recreating daily life in antiquity. Here, with his cockfight of 1847, we have a massive painting of 4 feet by 6 feet that established his reputation with the Salon of 1847. In it, we do not have the heroes and philosophers of David. It is also not morally didactic in the sense that this is teaching us a moral lesson. Instead, he's going to be capitalizing on the interest in daily life people had. That will eventually lead to Impressionism, but we've already seen with realism. Only instead of focusing on the poor with a very coarse technique, he has a very refined and meticulously detailed finish to his work. And it's going to be showcasing these elements of daily life, but also subtle eroticism is what the public appreciate. Here you'll notice that the coloring and the detailed style are actually taken from Ingres, in the sense that we have here the semi-nude figures from antiquity, the male pressing a cock to fight another rooster here who's going to be rearing up to scratch him, while the female is going to be turning her body away, yet still intrigued, looking back over her shoulder at what's happening. His best known work is going to be that of Pygmalion's love of a sculpture that he made of an ideal woman that came to life. So here in his Pygmalion and Galatea of 1890, we have the famed king who's going to be embracing the statue that is leaning over to kiss him, as a faint image of Cupid is going to be firing an arrow at his back. Here again, we can see the daily life in antiquity is the interest here, carefully detailed from what the artist's studio would look like and his tools. The masks, once again, from operas and plays are going to be in the background here. The story, as one might imagine, is that of a king who cannot find a pure or virtuous woman. And so he carves one and falls in love with it and wants it to be real. So on the feast day of Venus, he sacrifices to the goddess of love and requests that she become real, and she does, and he marries her. Here we can see the same interest from Meissonier in the painting connoisseurs, whereby we have carefully researched details and meticulous paintings that were highly appreciated by the general public. And it functions much like a genre painting. So we find that the over-the-top details of a mythological or a biblical work are not seen here. Instead, we have this emphasis on what daily life was like. And so that grounds it in reality and makes it palpable and palatable for the general public. Now we know that Jerome has a reputation for North African work from the Near East, or Orientalism, from the 1850s onward. He did travel to Turkey, as a matter of fact, in 1853, and thus his works have a photographic and documentary quality to them, like the Prayer in the Mosque of 1872. Here we can see the interior of this hypostyle mosque with carpeting on the floor, as people will be praying towards the Qibla wall. So we find that the accuracy for the interior architecture of the structure is significant. So the photographic accuracy did rely, interestingly enough, on photos themselves, travelogues, and missionary reports. And this is going to anticipate ethnography or ethnographic studies. So if you look carefully, the clothing, the physiognomy, the accoutrement with which these individuals are going to be brandishing different types of weapons, swords, and or how they're praying is going to be significant. Such examples were not shown to be as moralistic as earlier in the century with the Massacre at Chios by Delacroix. And the reason is that there's a greater knowledge instead by the public. They have greater access, thanks to colonization and easy travel to North Africa and travel books about what it is actually like. So this notion of the barbaric hordes and of harems are going to be dispelled with greater information. Now that doesn't mean that these don't have subtle components of racism and or differentiating Eastern and Western morals. They do. It is just much more subtle and presented in a documentary fashion. Now here we have, again, Fromentin and his Arab Falconer of 1863, and this is more akin to the Orientalist scenes of Gros and Delacroix, much more action-oriented. Now, this artist took 3 trips to North Africa between the 1840s and 1850s. Here you'll notice that we have an outdoor rural scene with no sharp focus or attention to realism as with Jerome. The canvas, in other words, is not licked clean but left open and suggestive in many ways. So we find that this is another approach carrying on that romantic tradition. And while it certainly does not have the violence as seen earlier in Arab cavalry practicing a charge by Delacroix, it does, once again, have this type of action that is so sought after and seen to exemplify this other culture. We notice now it is much more calming, even though it is active with these diagonals and counter-diagonals of the horse and the birds, and instead is going to have an analogous color scheme of blue and green. So we have a wonderful, playful effect shown here. Now, Maxime Duchamp, the photographer, is going to head to Egypt in 1849 and 51 as part of the French Ministry of Public Education. He is commissioned to record the ancient Egyptian monuments and their inscriptions. This interest in Oriental themes can be seen here with the view of Cairo. These are non-archaeological views that were published in travel albums, the first of their kind, not being a scientific investigation of a culture or its people, but instead showcasing different picturesque views of what it would be like to travel, almost as though you were going to be heading abroad and you want to see the sights of different cities. Albums like this bridge the gap between the contrived picturesque images from Isabey, for instance, and the modern travel photography that we know today. As you would go to another foreign land and take these photographs to bring back to showcase these exotic experiences that you had. Now you notice that Duchamp and others would choose a view for maximum picturesque details that they found to be visually interesting. Here you'll notice we have a conglomeration of buildings that showcase what the French thought of this Orientalist area at this time, and that's going to be that it is going to be dirty, disorganized, and difficult to understand. There was also a market for photographs of these indigenous peoples, and this included both the exotic factor associated with it and for scientific information. By the mid-19th century, there was an interest in racial classification and would develop different topological categories when it comes to different people across the world. The trips to Algeria, Greece, and Egypt, for instance, of Cordier, are going to be to create the principle of human types for a museum, in which he created both men and women of different ethnic groups. As can be seen here, the color of the stone is meant to very carefully be selected to showcase the color of the skin of this Algerian here, along with traditional Algerian costumes that we have. Now, this is going to carefully record both the physiognomy of the individual and the costume for which they are known, seen here. The bronze and striated jasper, this polychromed and multicolored effect, was known since ancient Egypt, but now is going to be used instead of, for neoclassical purposes, for ethnographic purposes. Now, large-scale history painting, as in the Academy, lost prominence during mid-century. Only the female nude remained because Ong had anchored it into the academic program. Thus, we have the notion of the display nude, which became the standard for reclining nudes, as seen here with the grand odalisque. Giorgione and Titian had first designed the Renaissance understanding of the reclining female nude and couched it in the mythological tradition, especially of images relating to Venus. Here we have a variation on that type, the standing type, where she is not reclining, but instead looks out directly towards the viewer in this Anadyomene, or the C type of Venus. Now here is a birth of Venus with the three little putti that are going to be below, that are shooting arrows, holding mirrors up for her, as she's going to be draping her right arm over her head, exposing her armpit. Now, this is going to be in the tradition and meant to make one think of the birth of Venus, and this is a different type that Ong himself had instituted and was reprinted mid-century. So here we can see the contrapposto pose as we have this languid appearance and S shape of the figure as she's going to look off not directly at the viewer but slightly off to her right is going to be very appropriate and tell us a lot about the nudes that would be produced for the Salon of Venus. She is importantly desexed. There is very little by way of proper anatomy. This is an aestheticized nude who is streamlined and polished. There is no pubic hair. There is no genitalia. There aren't really even nipples in this instance. So it was appropriate for public consumption. We didn't have to worry about the realities of nudity. Instead, this is going to be an ideal nude. The positioning of the body of Venus here was so popular that it was reused in multiple paintings, such as The Source of 1820. Here we can find that the eroticized aspect of Venus is carried on almost directly from Giorgione in the original reclining nude here, the Sleeping Venus. Now she is, of course, tilted up and standing with the same arm draped over her head, with the hair extending down her back. We have the classical come hither pose in which one is going to be passively seducing a viewer, presumably an unseen male viewer for the male gaze. And this is what the exposed armpit does in these classical statues. The most famous from this period actually is from Alexandra Cabanel and The Birth of Venus of 1863, so popular that Napoleon III purchased it, and there were multiple copies made after it. In this instance, the pose is taken from Ong, but it deviates slightly from the formula, as she is going to be laying on top of the surf and seen at an angle with these angels hovering over her. Here she awakens from her slumber, coyly looking up at the viewer, much as we have the Venus of Urbino. Her chest is thrust out towards the viewer. It is seductive, but at the same time idealized and obtainable. Here we have a detail that we have here as she's slyly looking up at the putti around her, as though she is unaware that she's being looked at, but positioning her body in such a way that it is ideal for viewing. If we compare it to the Venus of Urbino, we have the same formula used here, with the tilting of the body towards the viewer, but not making direct eye contact with the viewer, for that would be challenging and would be quite masculine as far as the viewing angle is concerned. Now, if we are to compare this to a naturalist version of nudity, one by Courbet, for instance, in The Origin of the World, we can see the difference here. Everything is edited out, versus in the realist example, everything is left in. So here's the major difference between the two types of nudity, and how one would be considered appropriate for public viewing, while the other one was much too real for this reason. Next time, we'll continue on with the Second Empire, looking at Manet's works.